us wore a uniform. My grandfather was a soldier, my father was a soldier, and I was a soldier and a sailor. My mob, my family, from the hunter families, which are Bardi and Joey people from up the Dampier Peninsula, saltwater peoples, but I grew up mostly in Geraldton. So I first put a uniform on with the Army Reserve back in the late 80s, I think it was, about 89. I left the Navy not 89, 87. I left the Navy 10 years later in 1997. So I was Army first for 4 years in a country unit up north out of Geraldton, and then I was Navy directly after that. And one of the things about going into a uniform in a country town like Geraldton, being still quite a racist country town, where Aboriginal people, especially Aboriginal men in those days, were targeted by the police and various other things. It was often easier to go and find somewhere to hide. And lots of young fellas, I guess, did that by playing sports, playing footy. I did it by going into uniform. And being in an army uniform, being in a military uniform was actually one of the best things that could hide you from a whole lot of people at that time. The truth is, most people join the Defence Force not necessarily out of some innate sense of honour, or that's not how young people think. Mostly what you're trying to do is you're trying to leave the neighbourhood or leave the town or leave the situation that you grew up in. You might not want to get in trouble. You might have enough interesting jobs to do. You've known somebody who was in the Defence Force before, might have been an uncle or an aunt or whomever, grandfather, and they've told you all those stories that you grew up on that dressed it up, made it look like it was this beautiful flash thing. Got to go around and visit and see all these amazing things, and suddenly, when you arrive at that point and there's not much going on in your life, where you need to get away from things in your life, putting on a uniform looks pretty attractive. When you're in uniform, it's relatively easy to take part in Anzac Day. When you're in uniform, you're a representative of the unit you're attached to. And so you generally march on behalf of that unit and that unit's history. And if it's an Australian Army unit, then you're marching under that battalion's colours, or their battle history. And you're also connected back to those battalions that were in the First and Second World War. So most people who actually are still serving in uniform march in order to honour the nature of either their battalions and those who've gone before them. And it's very, very simple to do. Those of us who have gotten out, though, today, we're not necessarily marching for the Anzacs, because we're not Anzacs. We're not those men and women, actually, who were involved up there on that peninsula at that time during the First World War. We're not those people. All of those veterans have passed away and gone now, and their stories have gone with them. But I guess all of us grew up in their stories in one way or another. Even as a young boy growing up in Geraldton, I knew veterans from the First World War. When I was a little bloke knocking around in the RSL, running around their knees, and you'd hear these stories mostly by men who served to the First and Second World War at that stage, and then the Korean and Vietnam War, Malaysian intervention. But you're just a kid, and you're just hearing this buzz of all these different people meeting in this place, telling the stories over and over again. It's hard to be a part of something that sits so far back, but not so far back in a relatively, we're a young country. It's not so much it's hard to sit in that, it's hard to sit in the legend of it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Especially as an Aboriginal Islander person. And especially given how around 2000, when John Howard and his party came into power, there was a big push to really invest in Anzac Day as a national, almost a national day of celebration rather than a day of commemoration. The idea about Anzac Day is to stop and reflect on the cost of war and the loss, and to also commemorate those who were lost in that particular battle, commemorate those who were damaged, those who came home, but also to make space for the families and the communities that had holes left in them when their young people didn't come back. And the damage done after war all over the world. One of the things, though, that often gets pushed upon Australia now is that, the Anzac War is the making of Australia as a nation. Well, no, it wasn't. It was certainly a remarkable feat for those guys to come off that peninsula at the time without a shot fired and no one injured when they had to withdraw from that battle, from that peninsula and that campaign. When the Australian, New Zealand troops and all the others withdrew and removed themselves from the Gallipoli Peninsula. But that's not the making of us as a nation. That's not what defines us as Australians. We were already Australians before that as a nation, and that nation didn't involve us as Aboriginal people, and in fact that nation still didn't involve us as Aboriginal and Islander peoples until well after the 1967 referendum. So we weren't recognised as citizens that served, or Aboriginal people and Islander people weren't recognised as citizens that served alongside of the other citizens that served at that time. And so therefore they wouldn't necessarily had been in receipt of or been able to be awarded land as part of the Veterans Settlement Program afterwards in both the First and Second World War. They wouldn't have had any right to that land. They wouldn't have necessarily had any right to the same medals and awards that the others had because they weren't citizens to receive those awards. So it was a really, really difficult time for Aboriginal and Islander soldiers. Yeah. They may have been paid whilst they were out there, and they would have been paid whilst they were in. They weren't allowed to actually, in the First World War, it was actually, if you like, it was illegal for Aboriginal people to sign up. And they were actively, pushed away by the recruiters. Sometimes Aboriginal families, and there are really good examples here in around Nyungar country. The Haywoods, for example, they walked from one recruiting desk to the other across Nyungar country to find a recruiter that would go, let's say that you're European, shall we? And because you've got dark skin, and leave it at that, sign them up and let them in. Mm-hmm. But if they actually could see quite clearly that you're an Aboriginal person, they wouldn't necessarily sign you up at all. It was actually illegal for you to be a part of that at that time. And the same went for the Second World War, but they relaxed it a hell of a lot more in the Second World War, and they signed people up. But each of those soldiers, when they returned, or when their belongings were returned once they died, when they got back to their states, they weren't recognised as citizens. They were still actually, classed under, especially here in Western Australia. You returned and you came back under the 1905 Act, and you went back to your community, and you were still an unknown or a person who wasn't allowed to have any property, wasn't allowed to have any rights, wasn't allowed to claim or get paid in much the same way that anyone else was.